Hi guys, welcome to Bible Breakdown. We're doing James chapter 2. So the beginning of this chapter is titled The Sin of Favoritism. So just to start out, for verses 1 to 4, I wrote that this is a command to refrain from showing favoritism due to somebody's status. God sees past our appearances and into our hearts. So we need to show that we cherish God's creation with value. So the illustration shown here is basically two people. One is wearing rings and they're visibly wealthy, while the other one is a bit run down. They're wearing filthy clothes. And you're saying to the person with the rings, you're like, hey, I have this chair for you. Come sit here. But the one that's wearing filthy clothes, you kind of disregard them and don't give them as much value as the other person, telling them to just sit on the floor. The main idea here is that that's being very judgmental and showing favoritism due to somebody's physical appearance. But we should really be looking at somebody's heart. Now moving on to verses 5 to 7, I wrote, our true worth is in our relationship with God, not worldly status. So for here in verse 5, it says, listen, my dear brothers and sisters. Didn't God choose the poor in this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom that he has promised to those who love him? So that paints the picture showing how there's something bigger outside of what we have going on in the world. When we die and when it's time to go up to the Lord, things are going to change drastically. So all this rich stuff and poor stuff, it's not even going to matter. Now for verses 8 to 13, I wrote, don't be hypocritical and have selective obedience. It's not a game of let me pick and choose what best fits for my life. It's all or nothing. I also wrote to remember that we will be judged the way that we judge others, so we need to have mercy. So to sum up what I basically said, verses 10 and 11 paint that picture. It says, for whoever keeps the entire law and yet stumbles at one point is guilty of breaking it all. For he who says, do not commit adultery, also says, do not murder. So if you do not commit adultery, but you murder, you are a lawbreaker. You can't just do things that are convenient to your life. If you claim to be obedient to the law, you need to be obedient to the whole law. And these verses are basically just highlighting that. And then when I mentioned we need to have mercy because we'll be judged the way we judge others, is from verse 13. So it says, for judgment is without mercy to the ones who has not shown mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. Now for the rest of this chapter, it's titled Faith and Works. And for verse 14, okay, so I have a point for verse 14, which leads to verses 15 to 17. So stay with me. So first I want to read verse 14 and then my point will make sense. So verse 14 says, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but does not have works? Can such faith save him? So for that point I wrote, I know it has been said that we are saved by grace through faith, not by works. In this verse, it's referencing to live out our beliefs practically. So basically practicing what we preach. So an example of going against this is you having faith in what God says, but not practicing what it's saying. So this would be considered dead faith, and verses 15 to 17 is like a big example of that. So the example that they gave is a person is lacking clothes and they're lacking food, and you just tell them, go get some clothes and go feed yourself. You're just giving them empty words. It's like, you know that they need help. Why don't you actually help them? And especially if you're in a position to help, like I know some circumstances you really can't do much but give words of encouragement, and that's okay. But if you are in a position where you can help somebody in need, do it. And I feel like that also ties into that favoritism that they were talking about at the beginning of this chapter, because sometimes we have one situation but two different scenarios, and we're more willing to do the other scenario based off of the person's looks or appearance or how they present themselves. Like, we should always be willing to help somebody, especially if we're able to. And that leads me to verse 18 and 19. I wrote, this is a challenge to not only claim faith, but to demonstrate it through our actions. Remember, demons believe in God, but the difference with them is that they don't act in accordance to God's will. I love verse 19 because it says, you believe that God is one. Good. Even the demons believe, and they shudder. A modern day example of this would be like telling somebody that you love them. If you say that you love them, you're just saying it, but can you show somebody that you love them? And on the topic of examples, the rest of this chapter is showing two different examples of how faith and works go hand in hand. So the first example is from verses 20 to 24, and it's about Abraham. And I wrote, Abraham is a great example of what it looks like to have your actions show your faith. The example that they give for Abraham is when he was ready to give Isaac as an offering on the altar. So that's in verse 21. It says, "Wasn't Abraham our father justified by works in offering Isaac his son on the altar?" And then the second example is in verse 25, talking about Rahab and how her works were justified by receiving messages and sending them out in like different places. And that reference is in Joshua chapter 2, verse 8 to 13. Now, I think the last line in this chapter is very important. So it says, "For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead." So I wrote that faith is faith at the end of the day, but it's what are you doing with that faith? I feel like the comparison of like the body and the spirit and then faith and works is valid because it's like what is working inside that. So that's just something to keep in mind. But with that being said, that is the end of this chapter. That is all I have for you guys. And I will see you tomorrow for James chapter 3. I love y'all. God loves y'all more. Have a great night.